author and written several conjoined works of fiction and non-fiction, including Empires of the Indus and Leela's book. So Alice was a fellow with the Eccles Centre in 2020.
Coming up.
Right, but we awarded you several.
Oh yeah, you awarded me ages ago. Yeah.
Anyway, the pandemic sort of meant that not everybody came much later than they were going to. Anyway, we're absolutely delighted that Alice is with us now. Strangely, we've had several fellows who are sort of investigating the Peruvian guano trades, and Alice is one of them. So her talk is going to be called Peruvian Guano, British Poo, an exploration of mid-19th century exploitation.
You're not using that screen.
No.
I'll get rid of that.
Okay. That was amazing. That was so beautiful. So really moved. Hi everyone. So I take up my Eccles Fellowship in September. So this presentation today is very exploratory, and it's more indicative of, it's more like a kind of hopeful map through my eventual research at this stage of my thinking. I'm actually in the process of finishing my 4th book, which is called The Britannias, and it comes out in October, and it's a portrait of Britain through its islands. So it was just wonderful being paired with Martin. It wasn't at all random, it was kind of mystical, well done Raphael, because it was, why don't you put up one of your nice images, maybe?
Yes.
This is other part.
But just the sounds.
Yes, this is beautiful.
Maybe a bit.
Yeah.
In fact, Turner winds into the Britannias because Turner, this book is about the book which is coming out in October, for which I still have to finish the bibliography, the index, my first ever index, the acknowledgements, and the dedication. Hence the delay in getting to this new work. It's there's a chapter on Thanet, the Isle of Thanet, and actually Turner used to go to the Isle of Thanet because it's an island, and he said the skies were the most beautiful in all of Europe because there's just so much light coming in. And there's also a lot about music and sound and song and acoustic, beginning with the Neolithic and ending with Westminster. Anyway, this is the other book. What I'm here to talk about is the history and effects of the 19th century mining of not just Peruvian guano, but also Chilean saltpeter by British merchants. But it all part of my quest in writing these latest books. My first 2 books were the first book was about a river, amazing writing about rivers, by the way, a river in Pakistan, India, the Indus, the great Indus River, which rises in Tibet and falls into the sea, the Arabian Sea near Karachi in Pakistan. And my second book was set in Delhi and was interested in Sanskrit epic. But I wanted with these next projects to really kind of decenter my own experience and perspectives of Britain. And this new project about guano continues this work, taking as its central point of interest Peru's offshore islands, Islas Chincha, where I discovered completely by chance, I was really shocked to discover that my own Victorian ancestors, nobody had thought to mention this to me and my family, but had made their a sudden fortune in the mid-19th century, trading guano back to Britain. People sometimes used to mention that my grandmother had a piece of silver that was maybe Incan silver, and anyway, it was some ancestor of mine gathered it and took it from wherever it had originally been mined and made and brought it back to Britain. So guano is the shit of seabirds, and it had been part of Andean cultivation for centuries. I mean, literally since used as a fertilizer since 200 AD. By the time it was discovered for Europe by Alexander von Humboldt in 1804. The Gibs family are from the West Country of England, and they had been merchants during the 18th century, and they traded Devonian wool into Spain, not very successfully. They lived in Madrid part of the time, and they were fluent in Spanish, but they hadn't by any means made huge amounts of money. In fact, they were in debt. They were hugely in debt, and they had a fund which they called Las Sagradas Deudas. Is that the right pronunciation? Into which they collectively, as a family, tried to pay off the sums they owed, and it was a huge source of shame for them. But in the 1840s, they they entered the Latin American market, and one of their agents in Lima told them of this wonder drug called guano, which was really easily obtained from the islands off the coast of Peru. And this was the poo of seabirds, cormorants mostly, which had accumulated there for centuries and centuries in deposits sometimes 300 feet deep. And it was said to work like a miracle on Peruvian farms, and none of the Peruvian potatoes ever got blight, it was said, and it would make dead timbers sprout whole forests. There are letters about this written from these Gibs brothers to each other saying, should we go for it? Samples were sent back. It seemed like it was true, and there was soil depletion. There was a crisis of kind of soil fertility in Britain at the time, agricultural crisis, and so they went for it, and indeed it completely changed their fortunes, and it had other effects, which is something I'm going to be looking at in my research. The firm acquired the global monopoly of guano from the Peruvian government, and from then on they were more or less set. They used local Peruvian agents to acquire labour on the mines, the blackbirders. The Peruvians themselves wouldn't do this work because it was horrible, toxic, dangerous work. This was before the days of PPE, obviously. It was carcinogenic. You're mining this shit, and it's carcinogenic, and it's lung problems. There was horrible stories of them loading these ships, of the British merchants loading these ships so heavily off the islands that a ship leaves the port and then capsizes. So they were using indentured labour from China, and then China bans the Opium Wars happen, and China doesn't want British merchants to use its population as transported labour anymore, so there's a story of the capture of 1,500 Easter Islanders. So we have a situation in which, the British it's interesting because the British the idea of Spanish colonialism in Peru had kind of been this kind of tintillating thing in Britain. It was portrayed often as the zenith of cruelty. There's Robert Burton writes about Indian slaves in the mines of Potosi in his Anatomy of Melancholy in 1621, and William Davenant stages a musical play which is called The Cruelty of the Spaniards in Peru in 1658. But it seems that by the 19th century, the cruelty in Peru is being disseminated by British merchants, and they're working these toxic mines involving this back-breaking labour. And for the Peruvian government, the money changes everything. The money made from the monopoly has such far-reaching political implications. It funds wars with Spain. The Chincha Islands War, there was actually a series of wars. Guerra Hispano-Subamericana. Again, I'm looking at my... Guerra, thank you. And these are coastal naval battles between Spain and its former colonies, Peru, Chile, Ecuador, Bolivia. Spain had tried to seize the islands, and Peru and Chile had collaborated to fight off this threat before then fighting each other and Bolivia for control of the coastline and border and tax disputes. So in Latin America, the guano business and the guano wars leave an indelible mark. You see it in, and this again is the very touching on the beginning of my research, but in Peruvian 19th century writing, it results in a period of introspection and the emergence of a different kind of Peruvian national culture in the 1880s. The indigenous population is being overlooked, but guano becomes this point of inflection which magnifies how cultural aspects of the emergence of the Peruvian nation are marked by mining, economics, international involvement in their politics and ecosystem. And guano really plays a part in the shaping of these nations. The British donated a consignment of naval warships to the Bolivians as a consolation prize for losing the war with Chile. They lose a long bit of their coastline. And these are dismantled and they're taken on llamas to Lake Titicaca, and they're still there. In Peru, Cesar Vallejo, the poet, who's apparently very difficult Spanish, and without any contact with the European avant-garde, he's experimenting with all these distinctive forms of language and writing massive amounts on guano, long after the mining stopped through the 20s, 30s, 40s. Apparently his first ever poem has him taking a shit in a prison. And guano is therefore, I'm going to be looking at how guano is not just shaping the economy and thus the politics, and thus the culture, and thus the literature and the identity. And it's a medium in which all these circulating processes are being articulated and erasing and making marks on a country out of this very landscape. In the 1860s, this family from the west of England, the Gibs family, shut down their warehouses in Peru and moved south to Chile, where they mined saltpeter in the north of the country. And this, of course, is the substance that's used in gunpowder as well. Peru is always spoken of in the literature of this family, but I knew they must have been in Chile before knowing it for sure. After I visited the house, Tinsfield, which they renovated as a monument to high Victorian luxury, using the profits from guano. It stands outside Bristol on a hill and was recently acquired by the National Trust. My partner is Chilean, and as my children and my mother and I walked around the house, and this was a house that my mother knew from her childhood, and she had this aged uncle, Richard, who used to every 10 years invite all his relatives for lunch, and she remembers sitting at this enormously long table and him opening these cans of meat being opened, I guess it was spam or something, and presented, passed down on plates down this table. And I was in you walk around the house, the National Trust house, and there's all this kind of really Catholic Spanish religious art that they collected. And then you get to the boudoir of Blanche Gibbs. And it's probably, the wood is it's this beautiful blonde wood, and it looks like it was carved yesterday. So it's pretty similar to this actually, but it's kind of solid wood along the bottom half, and there's carved about hip height all the way around the room are fruit and vegetables. And my little daughter, who was 10, noticed that one of the things carved into this frieze of vegetation was what it said on the label was the Chilean bellflower. And so I texted my partner and I said, hold on, does this national flower of Chile also grow in Peru? And he said, no, it grows mostly in the south of Chile. And so then one has to think, what's going on here? And of course, it turns out that yes, they closed down their mines in Peru, and they went partly because it was politically unstable, apparently, being in Peru, and they went south to Chile, and they then began exploiting the mines in the north of Chile. Now, it turns out that the Chilean bellflower, which is called Lapageria rosea in Latin, is actually called Copiue in Mapudungun, which is the Mapuche language, and it's from the forests of southern Chile, and it's still cultivated in this house by the National Trust gardeners. It turns out that this beautifully carved flower is a symbol of joy and gratitude and friendship in Chile. It has a story, a kind of Romeo and Juliet story about this tragic love story between a Mapuche woman and a Pehuenche man. Mapu means earth, Che means people, so it's people who fight for the earth, amazing name. They were forbidden to join together, and they were killed or somehow died, and their bodies fell into the water, and up grew this flower as a symbol of their love. And the name is from Kopi, was the man, and Ue was the woman, so you get Kopue. I also spoke recently with the Chilean artist and poet Cecilia Vicuña. So she had at the Tate Modern, she had the Turbine Hall, and she made this really beautiful work. I think it's called Rainforest Kipu, about this lost language of knots that used to exist in the Andes. And I was talking to her about my last book, where we got on to talking about Peru and guano, and she said to me, poop is so sacred, and it's something I've written about a lot in my poetry, and it always gets censored. She said even now that she's this world famous artist and poet, they just won't publish her poo poems. It's really interesting. So, Britain, back to Britain, the importation of guano made vast amounts of money for the family firm, the Gibs family, but there were dissenters even at the time. Karl Marx was one of the first to perceive the ecological and social folly of mining one ecosystem for the sake of another, singling out the guano trade in particular as the epitome of metabolic disturbance. And he may well have been right. In Britain, the importation of this cheap fertiliser put an end to the local night soil trade. Night soil is something I knew about only from my work in India, but of course it was until the mid-19th century there were families who would gather raw sewage and they would take it out of London to the farms of Hertfordshire and Essex, and where it was used as a fertiliser. And it may well be responsible for the kind of excellent, London is a really brilliant place for kind of fruit, for example, which is partly its climate, but also the really good soil. So the importation of cheap fertiliser leads to the decline in the night soil trade, the compensatory popularity of flush toilets, which are invented around the same time, and then you get everybody flushing their sewage into the rivers of London and into the Thames, and I'm just using London as an example because it's where we are. And you get the Great Stink of 1858, and because the Thames is tidal only really as far up as Westminster, the sewage, the shit, washes backwards and forwards in front of the Houses of Parliament, and these politicians are fainting in their rooms and their offices, and as a result, because the shit is literally in front of their eyes, something is done about it, and in this case it's the massive sewage system which is put in place. And the ecologically damaging effects of both, therefore, soil fertiliser and water flush sewage. I mean, it's so crazy that we flush away our poo and give it, pollute our waterways, are only really being recognised now. We're basically in a massive pollution crisis of British waterways at this very moment. An argument has also been put forward recently that the trade in guano and potatoes, basically the kind of international trade from Latin America, resulted in the potato blight. And therefore the Irish famine. At the time, guano was sold, as I said, as a miracle blight-free substance, but research has proved an Andean origin for the blight. In the USA, meanwhile, English farming success was pitched to North American industrialists, and guano was actually one of the substances used to build Central Park, and it also to shore up several agro-industries in the United States. The USA passed the Guano Islands Act in 1856, annexing 200 islands worldwide. Interestingly, and this comes back to Scotland and the massive amounts of guano that you see off the coast of Scotland. The climate wasn't right in most of these places. Peru's Chincha Islands are very dry, there's hardly any rain, so the deposits retain high levels of the potassium and nitrate and phosphates that's in the guano and make it such a super fertiliser. Unlike rained-on islands, for example, around the coast of Britain, where the chemicals just leach out into the sea and it's absolutely pointless annexing any guano island of Britain and other places. But anyway, in the US, citizens were given the mandate by the president to claim any uninhabited island for the United States, anywhere in the world. And until 1909, when the guano craze came to an end after scientists discovered how to manufacture synthetic fertilizer, the US Army, I think it still is, mandated to defend guano claims today. So the effects of the trade and its wars and the money and the culture it's created are still playing out today. All of this from the deposits of some faraway birds. So I'm taking a deep breath now and telling you that I'm at the beginning of this new project, which in many ways is my most complicated and personal one to date, and it's obviously going to require deep immersion in new histories and languages and literatures. I began the journey in December 2022. I was writer in residence at the Custom House in Exeter, which was the port that my ancestors first traded from when they were these impoverished merchants just starting out. And then I take up my Eccles Fellowship at the British Library and will use as my starting point the Centre's assembly of materials on Victorian British colonial expansion into the Americas and the comparative mining frontiers in South America. And I think always I'm going to be looking at, my first two books, as I said, were about history and culture in India and Pakistan, and kind of using that, this is the 1850s, it's the Indian War of Independence, it's the emergence of the East India Company, it's the transformation of that into British imperialism, and then you have this completely parallel, untrammeled, unchecked mercantile exploitation going on in a different part of the world. And it's going to be really interesting comparing the two. This is a work which crosses borders and oceans and cultures and languages, and here I am at the outset, looking around me and searching for different ways to understand this material and its implications. And I've really begun wondering, also with my previous couple of books, but whether as an author I should be looking at this knowledge and its acquisition differently. Is there another way to understand this material? Should I be going in sideways, inside out, upside down? I don't know. I began searching generally in my work, but in particular with this project, for collaborators and partners. And during this search, which I came across these two Chilean voice artivists from the feminist collective Hilanderas. And I spoke to them about the work, and we began exchanging ideas and thoughts. And I spoke to them about the seabirds of Peru and the deserts of Chile, from which the nitrates were mined and from which today other elements such as lithium are also being taken. And Steffi and Valet, who are here today, responded with this poetic sung creation, which they're going to perform for us here and now. And the piece is called in Spanish, La Voz de la Tierra, and in English that means the voice of the earth. Escuchamos el choque de las hojas en las olas danzantes, el lagrimía de la lluvia y el cantar de un chuta, un pelicano o un ave mensajera.
Distribuida de justa manera. Ay, que mis secretos les importen a quienes no entiendan. Por solo existir en este planeta.
¿Qué esperas, amada compañera, si les diste todo tu poder? Cuando solo para explotarte te miraron con cautela.
Ay, me duele el lomo.
Maravillosa Madre Tierra, tu suelo es también composición nuestra. Si tú quisieras, podemos alivianar este dolor. Si tan solo el viento soplara fuerte y a su vaivén dejar a quienes no valoran el centro que les otorga y el canto de los árboles acechara a quienes no comprenden tu lenguaje y el fuego irreverente con su limpieza profunda reseteara el dolor causado.
Gracias, querido viento. Si tan solo aceptara lo que me ofreces, entonces mi muerte sería inminente. Marginales nos defienden. Marginales nos defienden. No podría yo quitarles el poder de escuchar esta canción. En cada momento, una oportunidad de ser tribu ellos son. Aquellos que no le escuchan les llaman les sin voz. Les que no saben, el exterminio es la opción. Gracias, querido viento. Nuevamente me has aliviado este dolor. Esta nueva canción es es una nueva vuelta a la luna y al sol.
La orquesta se prepara. El coro sin voz se levanta.
El día es hoy y magia sucede cuando se empieza.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Great. That's amazing. I just feel like we've just been taken on an extraordinary journey. So unexpected and it's wonderful. So thank you, Alice. Amazing talk. I mean, should we just sit here? Is it a bit formal, or do you want to stand there, or just stay there? I mean, yeah. I mean, we could just kind of field questions. I mean, it's nice for people to see you. So I might have to just go here. Have a chat. Let's put it forward over there. Great. Just feel like I can use my voice in such a boring way after lessons and how to do more interesting things. So, would anybody like to kick off the question? We've got about 10 minutes, just under 10 minutes, and then we've got the room for a bit longer after, we can stay afterwards as well, but we'll finish it too, yes.
I had a couple of questions for Martin. One was, how are you intending to sort of produce this as a work that you will do publicly? And also, I mean, you obviously come from the northeast, but you had sort of quite a lot of Gaelic in there. I just wondered how you access that, or whether you know any Gaelic, or...
No, I don't know any Gaelic. My wife's Irish, but she speaks a bit of Irish, but not very much. Her mum actually taught Irish Gaelic for a bit, but I don't know this. But I've always been interested in that kind of part of the world. My dad lived up there for quite a long time, so I spent quite a lot of time up there. Yeah, kind of Oban and those islands around there. Yeah, so kind of, I suppose that's why. But I mean, it really came from going to Nova Scotia, really. So it came kind of backwards, if you know what I mean. And just seeing the kind of, just how deeply it was embedded in that land, in that landscape, and the people there, and like almost more so than in Scotland, like because of that kind of exile kind of thing of the being so much incredibly stronger when you're there. So yeah, that's how I came to the kind of Gaelic stuff. And I while we were me and Helen, who I went with, we've put together a book and a soundscape that's coming out this year. And so while I was putting that together, I got in touch with the Beaton Archive and Institute in Cape Breton. And they were really helpful, and they gave me use of all kinds of recordings of Gaelic songs. There's also lots of Micmac songs as well. It's Acadian songs. It's a like layered archive of sound histories. So that's been really useful, and a lot of that kind of comes to the work. In terms of how what it's gonna be, I'm not really sure. It's always this kind of struggle, isn't it? Especially when you kind of, I mean, I find it tough to get the academic-y style stuff in there. I think maybe I'd put a bit more of that in there because I was doing this in the library. If I was doing it in a venue or a theatre or something, that would have probably sat much further back. But I hope it would come through in the other parts, the other elements to it anyway. But it is interesting, kind of using that stuff. Sometimes I think it's always kind of, especially when you're presenting it in this kind of more immersive way. You've got to look for quotes, academic quotes that not only kind of talk about the things you're talking about and like point towards it, but they've got to sound really nice as well. They've got to like have some kind of poetic texture to them. So there's always that. But I don't really know what the answer to your question is, but it's an ongoing thing, as everything is.
Thank you.
on that. I also found that really interesting. I'm a linguist by training, and I'm very intrigued by recorded voice and how that has shifted really our sense of, you know, as you say, there's the one quote before sound and language, spoken language was fleeting, but it's not anymore. We can record sound now. And I think it's amazing how you put that into practice. But I'm wondering, maybe similarly, and maybe there is no answer yet, maybe in digital storytelling in the exhibition, how you put that into something more permanent, if you're even interested in that.
I am, but it's I definitely am. Of course, it is a really difficult thing because you're kind of freezing something, you know. I mean, even you go back to like Walter Scott, you know, writing down those border ballads and things like that, you know, that basically stopped them developing and changing as they always did. They were passed down generations orally. A lot of the time, it was only one person had one ballad to themselves. That was their ballad, and then they passed it down to the next generation orally. And as soon as they were written down, then they were just frozen in time. Then, and they still felt it, but you know what I mean. And similarly, the kind of Mi'kmaq stuff, you know, and usually they were one of the only kind of Native American language groups to have a written language before the Europeans got there. But it was mainly just, I mean, it's hieroglyphics, but it was mainly just for memory devices and things like that. It wasn't for literature or historical or anything like that, you know. So it was all just passed down. So yeah, it's just a long-winded answer, I suppose, but it's hard to kind of solidify things, I think, and I do like this kind of live kind of feel because it just feels like it's there and then it's gone again, as it's meant to be, really.
And I guess sheds a new light onto poetry again, which we got so used to reading on the page and not.
I mean, I really struggle like when I go to poetry readings and people have got the book there and they're kind of like this.
Yes.
You get everything all the time.
Could I just ask you, Alice, just in terms of the actual mechanics of getting the guano? Because I remember learning about it at school, and I guess my memory, I just thought it was going to be like along the cliffs, and I just remember thinking, how on earth did the people sort of get this? But is it like literally all over the island? And you said it's like 100 feet deep or something. So was it just like soil effectively?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been there yet because this is just at the beginning, but it's literally ladders, ropes, pulling it off the islands, plunk it on ships, lots of dust, dirty work. I mean, it's kind of, but surface mining, it's not going very deep, you're just digging down until you got it. But yes, I guess there's something also about mining, you know, where we're trying to find things out, and in a way that's the kind of responsibility of, or maybe not, maybe the opposite. I remember when I lived in Orkney, and I was a writer in residence for a season at the Nessa Brodka dig, and you're mining basically. If you're an archaeologist, you're mining, you're staring at the earth, and you're there with, in Victorian times they did it with spades. Now they have these tiny little trowels, and you're kind of just very nice. And then there's this incredible moment where the thing that you're looking for, the thing that you're mining, suddenly the earth falls away and you've got something there. And it could be a little bit of flint, or it could be a worked tool, or it could be a ceramic thing, but you're taking something out. And it's in a way it's strangely reductive, because you're removing, and you're destroying to get at the thing you're at. And in a way, I don't know, that's what I've been thinking about with this knowledge. It's really interesting what you say about freezing the song collectors freezing. I mean, it was so important, that work, wasn't it, in Gaelic especially, because it was and they were one generation came after another. There was Macpherson, and there was Carmichael, and there was Kennedy Fraser, and they were all building on each other's mining work of mining. But I guess they were writing down. I've always been really interested in that moment where you shift from an oral culture to a written one. my second book was looking at that in the Mahabharata. There's a really interesting moment in this Sanskrit epic. The Mahabharata means big India, and it's this Sanskrit epic of war and domination and interfamilial fighting, these cousins who fight each other to the death and humiliate each other's women, and there's lots of obviously demons and gods and goddesses intervening. But there's one really interesting moment that happens, which is a later interpolation, but it's very telling. And it's the god Ganesh is visited by Vyasa the sage, who's the author of this incredibly huge work, which is something like 9 times the length of the Bible. And he says to Ganesh, please can you write this down for me? And Ganesh, who's the elephant-headed god, takes his tusk and he begins writing, and Vyasa says, you can't stop, you've just got to carry on writing. And I was always wondering, what on earth is this episode doing in this text, which is an orally transmitted text, and again it would have been this culture that we see in Scotland where people are passing on their stories and their recitations, and in this case it would have been, it's very elitist, it's Brahmin priests. But this moment has come in, and what's happening in India at the time is that you've had this orally transmitted religion and culture of Sanskrit and the Brahmin elite, and then in comes Buddhism, and Buddhism is the first religion in South Asia where they have their own written down holy texts. And you get this moment also in Britain where things suddenly get written down when you have Christianity coming into these islands. And suddenly you get these stories from the Middle East, and you get these local Irish stories, and you get the Celtic culture and the Druidic culture that hasn't been killed off yet, and it all gets mishmashed into these written texts. So writing, yeah, it's mining, it's freezing, but it's also saving something. I mean, I think the fact that these texts exist is kind of a miracle, isn't it?
Oh yeah.
But how to, I mean, it's wonderful your work where you're representing the ephemeral nature of it, and that song, those beautiful noises from Gaelic. Oh God, can't remember the original questions about that.
I think that's great. That's great. All sorts of directions.
Can I just...
Yeah, well, it's 2 minutes past, so we just have one more question, and then we finish it. Then we can stay in the room a bit longer, but understood where some people might want to go. But yes,
Okay.
let's have a past.
I was just going to say, I mean, very sort of, thank you for both pieces. I think that that point that was written, I just took it. History will be different if it had been expressed by us.
Yeah.
I think, and knowing Spanish and a little bit of the performance, that would be lovely to have it translated into English, because I think it tied up all this sort of intuition about the whole thing of displacement, the whole thing about birds that somehow appear as a very symbolic, and it was in the soundtrack constantly, and the island, the borders of the coast and migration, very much about that sort of the spirit of the migration, and how it's impossible actually to, we talk as Colombians living here in UK, people talk about the grief of migration, leaving your land, leaving the language, the religion, everything, and being thrown into the unknown. And in a way, ecologically, it's just linked so beautifully with the whole performance that we're doing about the earth and the wind, because it's very much about the history of extraction in Latin America and the goods that come out of it. And it continues, actually, that's what we're living now with the environmental crisis. So I think there's a lot of very, very deep ecological points there.
Actually, I was going my question was somehow less those lines, but if you explore the symbolic function of the bird pool, because there's something quite fascinating about the value of something that is not valuable.
Yes.
Yeah, it's very kind of Freudian in a way.
Yeah.
Just go.
Well, on that note,
Thank you.
we'll finish it. Thank you so much, Alice, and to Martin, and to our 2 wonderful performers, and thank you to everybody for coming. We've got another Summer Scholars, I think it's Friday, isn't it?
Friday,
Okay. So, thank you. We look forward to it.
I won't do as good as